Okay, so welcome to this joint event tonight that is hosted by the Uppsala Forum for Democracy, Peace and Justice and the Student Association for Foreign Affairs at Uppsala University, Utrikespolitiska föreningen. And tonight's topic is the upcoming US elections. So my name is Patricia Mendes. I'm the Director of Research at Uppsala Forum, and I just want to say a few words about this organization before I give the word to tonight's speakers. So Uppsala Forum is a multidisciplinary collaboration at Uppsala University between the Faculty of Arts, Languages, Law, and Social Sciences. So we contribute with funding and coordination of events, research support in a variety of ways for researchers and PhDs in the area of democracy, peace, and justice, which means that we organize joint seminars, workshops, conferences, roundtable discussion like this one, and courses. Now, our mission is also to strive towards a greater internationalization of research and to develop good opportunities for collaborations and projects and act as a platform for external partners. Now, an important thing about our association is that we view democracy, peace, and justice not as three separate objects, but as one integrated research field. So democracy, peace, and justice comes as three parts or a triad within the same constellation of values, which are all fundamental for modern political thinking. Now, we also work thematically by developing particularly cross-sections of this research field. And we do that by focusing on topics that cut across the field and offer particular challenges for democracy, peace, and justice. And among the challenges that we have selected, because Uppsala University performs leading research in these subfields, and they're all topical for our societies, we have selected three challenges, that is migration and globalization, climate and sustainability, and the digital age. And it's within these three challenges that we're currently working. Now you can find out more about Uppsala Forum on our website at uppsalaforum.uu.se. Now tonight we will hear Lance Bennett, Karin Henriksson, Bill Haltom, Frida Stranne, and Dag Blank, who will also be sharing tonight's roundtable discussion on the US elections under the title, The Most Consequential Election of Our Time. Now, before handing the word over to the speakers, I would want to invite our co-organizer at Utrikespolitiska föreningen to perhaps say a word.
Yes, thank you so much. Hi everyone, my name is Mate and I'm one of the head of lecturers at the Uppsala Association of Foreign Affairs. The association was founded in 1948 with the goal of raising awareness and promoting debate around international issues. This is our main goal. It's the lecture group, and what we do is that we organize lectures every week on a wide variety of topics regarding international affairs. The lectures usually take place on Wednesdays and nowadays online as well. And we also, as you can see today, collaborate with Uppsala Forum on these interesting topics. This is also our second event this year already with Dag Blank, and I'm super excited to see what we're going to talk about tonight.
Thank you. One word of practicality before handing the word over to Dag. If you want to ask questions to any one of tonight's speakers, please use the chat function on Zoom. Mattias Westerlund, who is the research assistant at Uppsala Forum, will gather your questions and convey them to the share. So thank you for writing down your questions in the chat function. Now, Dag, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patricia and Marte, and welcome to all of you on both sides of the Atlantic to this transatlantic panel discussion / seminar. I'm very happy to see as many as 186 people participating, according to my screen, at least, and that's tremendous. Many more than I thought perhaps would come, or maybe not, given the enormous interest in what is going on in the United States tomorrow. It does illustrate one of the advantages with Zoom. It would have been very hard to gather 186 people in a seminar room in Uppsala from all the places where you come from and to have a discussion. So in these difficult times, at least this is a bright spot, I think, that we can use this technology to our advantage. So we are very happy. I represent the Swedish Institute for North American Studies at Uppsala University, and we are very happy to co-host this event again. We do it every 4 years when we post the question, discuss the question about the upcoming American election. So it was 4 years ago that we asked the question of our panelists, who will win tomorrow? And I think almost all of them gave the wrong answer 4 years ago. They were not alone, of course, but we will ask that question also at the end of our discussion today. Just some further practicalities. We will go on for 2 hours. We will end at 8 p.m. Swedish time, which is 2 p.m. Pacific time, and 11 a.m. I'm sorry, 11 a.m. Pacific time, and 2 p.m. on the East Coast. We have at least one participant from the American East Coast. If we have some participants from the Midwest, it will be 1 p.m. in the Midwest, I think. Yes. Anyway, we have almost 2 hours ahead of us of discussions. And the structure is the following. First, we will have introductory remarks by the 4 panelists or the 4 speakers, and they have chosen certain angles that they think are particularly important now given the election. And after that round of about 10 minutes from each person, we will have a break of about 5 minutes or 4.5 minutes perhaps, where we can stretch our legs. And then we come back, have a glass of water maybe, or whatever you want to do. And then we come back, and then we have some questions. I pose some questions to the panelists about the elections, questions that I have chosen, only I have chosen, as they say in the presidential debates. I have asked them earlier now today, before you all join in, if they were okay with them, and they were. And after that, we will have a discussion among the panelists. And after that, there will be an opportunity for your questions that you will have submitted to the chat function. And then that Matthias will forward to me. Is that correct, Patricia?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't have to look at the chat questions. He will do that. Okay, we will see how many questions we can do. If there are 190 people right now signed in, it's going to be hard to answer 190 questions, but we will try to group them in some way. All right. Also, are we to suggest that people in the audience turn off their cameras? Is that correct, Matthias? Yes, Patricia?
Yes, it is correct.
Yes. So if you can turn off your cameras, I think that helps things, apparently, the technical aspects of things. The speakers will remain with cameras turned on. Okay, so before we start, let me just introduce the speakers. I will introduce them in one go here. The first speaker will be Lance Bennett, who is the Ruddick C. Lawrence Professor of Communication and Political Science at the University of Washington in Seattle, from where he is joining us, or he's joining us from outside Seattle, I think. He was also the founding director of the Center for Communication and Civic Engagement at that same school. Lance is an old friend of SINAS and of Uppsala University. He has been here many times, has worked with us, and we're so happy to see you back. I should also note that Lance has an honorary PhD from Uppsala, and that's a very high honor. And it's very good to have honorary doctors all over the world, because you can call upon them and ask them to participate in panel discussions, and they tend to say yes. So that's Lance Bennett. Then our second speaker will be Karin Henriksson, who will be joining us from Washington, D.C. She is a longtime correspondent for Svenska Dagbladet and now a freelance journalist in Washington. She's the author of numerous books on American politics and history in Swedish for a Swedish audience. She has written a biography of Donald Trump, the only Swedish language biography of Donald Trump, I think, so far. She's also a member of the editorial team of the blog and podcast Amerika Analys that several of us are involved in. And we're very happy to have Karin. Then the third speaker will be William Haltom, or Wild Bill, as it says on your screen there, professor of political science at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, also on the American West Coast. Bill is the holder of the 2020-2021 Distinguished Fulbright Chair in American Studies at Uppsala University. We are fortunate enough to have a Fulbright Chair every year, and Bill is the person who holds that chair. Unfortunately, of course, due to the pandemic, he was unable to travel to Uppsala and will not join us in the flesh, so to speak, but he has participated in different ways. He has met the students in the politics class that he was scheduled to teach in the fall here and participated in that way. And he is, of course, then here now tonight. And the last speaker will be Frida Stranne, who is a senior lecturer in political science at Halmstad University College in Sweden, and an affiliated researcher here at SINAS, at the Swedish Institute for North American Studies. She's a very well-known commentator on American politics in Sweden, in Swedish media, on several TV stations, and she has a weekly column in the largest, one of the largest Swedish newspapers, Expressen. And she's also a member and the founder, actually, of the blog and then eventually podcast Amerika Analys. So we have two people joining us from the two Americans joining us from the United States, from the American West Coast. Two Swedes, one joining us from Washington, D.C., and one joining us from Stockholm. And then there's me, Dag Blank, the director of SINAS, and I'm also joining you from Stockholm. So with that said, I think I will give the word to Lance Bennett and ask Lance to give his introductory remarks, about 10, or we have given him a few extra minutes, 3.5 extra minutes, actually. Lance, go ahead.
Thank you, Dag, for the 3.5 extra minutes. I hope I can use them well. Hello, everyone. I'm very sorry that we're not in lovely Uppsala for this event, but it's good to be here nonetheless. What I thought I would do is to try and explain how all of this happened. How did we get here? But first, let me talk a little bit about where we are at this point. Some of the events of recent weeks include an armed militia group that was planning to kidnap the governor of Michigan and put her on trial. And it's maybe worth noting that political organizations funded by the DeVos family, the same as Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, helped organize the earlier armed occupation of the Michigan state capitol, and that occupation included members of the kidnapping ring. Before all of this happened, Trump called on his followers at rallies to liberate Michigan and Virginia, whose governor was also targeted in a kidnapping. And other Republicans have called for their supporters, including signaling armed militias, to go to voting places to make sure voting is, quote, fair. It turns out that Republican efforts to intimidate voters in the recent era date back to the 1980s and were barred by court orders that unfortunately have recently expired. States such as Florida, Georgia, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Texas, and other key states have long histories of voter suppression that involve voter identification laws, barriers to registration, discounting large numbers of ballots, gerrymandering, or lining up voting districts to benefit the Republican Party, and on and on. Recently, in the last few years, Trump has added 3 Supreme Court justices to a Republican majority that has already ruled in favor of voter denial practices. And recently, led by Trump, many Republicans are claiming that voting by mail and early voting are not secure. And this is really because in some key swing states, Democrats tend to vote more by mail or vote early than do Republicans. And as you probably know, the Trump administration has already tried to sabotage the United States Postal Service. And I will just stop this opening segment by inviting you to watch out for Pennsylvania. I expect there to be legal challenges that will tie up the state of Pennsylvania and send it to the Supreme Court for decision, and that could make the difference in the election. So these and other examples of intimidation and election fraud are occurring against the backdrop of a pandemic, the viral spread of disinformation, the worst racial conflicts in more than 50 years in this country, and a nation undergoing a serious identity crisis for which there is unfortunately no therapeutic solution. So how did all this happen? Well, let's turn the clock back 50 years and take a kind of a dash through modern American history. And about 50 years ago, the Republicans launched a new economic agenda for the country that included the privatization of public services. And you know some of this story in Sweden because the neoliberal regime has kind of touched most of the democracies one way or another. But beyond the privatization of public services, there's been serious reductions in social spending by governments because the story told is that welfare creates dependency on government. And then the final piece of this plan was the deregulation and outright subsidy of many big business sectors in America. So this line of politics was initially advertised with the slogan "Morning in America," pitched by that earlier TV star turned politician, Ronald Reagan. It currently goes under the advertising of "Make America Great Again," promoted by the reality TV star, Donald Trump. There have been many twists and turns in the road between Reagan and Trump, but throughout this period, business and political interests have successfully expanded the flow of money and special interest influence in politics so that the American democracy has long represented the wealthy few over the many citizens. So despite their money advantage and their media advantages, Republicans have had trouble selling this program to majorities of citizens who have suffered wage stagnation, a growing inequality, deteriorating quality of schools and other public services, rising costs of college, and perhaps most importantly of all, loss of political voice. And I just noticed that I went, no, I'm there still. So as a result, the Republican coalition of hundreds of political organizations, lawyers, think tanks, and others have focused on a broad program, and I use this term, and I invite you to think about it, of engineering minority rule in America. The core of that program is to make it harder for people to vote for Democrats, particularly minority citizens. So here's the beginning snapshot, and then I'll flash forward to now. But in 1980, a young activist, or young Republican activist named Paul Weyrich addressed a religious right conference in Dallas, Texas, and told them to get over their good government or goo-goo beliefs that everyone should vote. He told them simply that the more people vote, the less leverage the right, and particularly the religious right, will have over government. Paul Weyrich is a co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, the Moral Majority, and a number of other organizations that are part of the engineering of minority rule in America. So the Republican Party went to work and over the next 20 years assembled a moral values coalition of religious right, anti-abortion, guns groups, and I think most importantly of all, racists. Since the US was heading toward a white minority society, racism became an increasingly important appeal to generate public approval. And you've seen the racial conflicts going on your TV screens this summer. In the early days, the racism was delivered in coded language, such as Reagan's welfare queens or George Bush I's Willie Horton ads that charged the Democratic candidate with releasing dangerous Black men from prison. But now the racism is out in the open with Donald Trump. And we have seen the blatant public executions of Blacks by white police officers, reflecting, I think, the enabling of racist violence from the right in this country. So it turns out that this coalition of what Hillary Clinton in 2016 called America's deplorables was still not enough to gain control of government. It's still a minority of about 40 to 45%. So I'm going to come back to where the Republicans are today with this, but I don't want to leave the Democrats out of this indictment. Are they blameless? No, they're not. They're not as responsible as the Republicans for the erosion of democracy. But let me note a couple of the highlights on the Democratic side. Following Morning in America, the Democrats finally came back to power with Bill Clinton at the time when the new global neoliberal economy promised cheap consumer goods and an age defined by wondrous communication technologies. In order to get into the global economy game, Clinton, as many, including Tony Blair, Gerhard Schroeder, and your own Swedish Social Democrats to some extent, began to swing away from union support. In Clinton's case, he signed the North American Free Trade Agreement. He stole welfare reform from the Republicans. He led the deregulation of media ownership and cooperated with Republicans on banking deregulation that led to the Great Recession of 2008. And all of these created huge conflicts and divisions in the party and cost them voters. So if we look at that great economic downturn of a decade or so ago, there was an uprising on both the left and the right, the Occupy Wall Street movement on the left, but the more important long-term uprising was the Tea Party on the right. And some of the architects of the engineering of minority rule, such as billionaire Charles Koch, decided to try to bring the Tea Party into the Republican Party. He succeeded in doing that. His organization succeeded in doing that. But he failed to educate the leaders of the Tea Party about libertarian economics. Instead, they brought with them a host of wild and unruly ideas about not only economics, but race and citizenship and rights into the Republican Party. So now the Republicans have a machine with many well-financed shadow or surrogate organizations that have ended up creating a political Frankenstein monster. And the party has been transformed into one that elected Donald Trump, who was surely not the first choice of many of the architects of minority rule. But Trump delivered huge tax cuts, more than the wildest dreams of the wealthy elite, threw money into the economy, and he outperformed earlier Republican presidents on delivering on all of the coalition wish lists, from gun lovers to anti-abortionists and indeed to racists. So the current Republican Party has committed itself to two very important programs to carry on its program of minority rule. The first is ramping up voter suppression, which has become widespread both in the red states and in the swing states, insofar as it's possible there. Pennsylvania, for example, North Carolina, and Florida, and Texas. And the voter suppression is now being given legal arguments to appeal to the conservative judges in the courts that Republicans have been packing for the last 15 years, including the Supreme Court. So you might call this part of the plan a coup by law. And the second part is to develop a full-on propaganda system to spread disinformation on a host of issues, lying about voter fraud, mail-in voter fraud and early voting fraud, denying climate change, opposition to wearing masks in a pandemic. I mean, this is crazy, it sounds, but it's a politically, emotionally bonding issue for Trump and his fans. And there's been a flood of false information about the spread and dangers of the virus itself. Trump has basically declared his fight against the virus successful and over. As Trump's mentor, Steve Bannon, put it so poetically, the Republican propaganda machine is flooding the zone with shit. So here's the question that I'm going to end on. It's hard to call America a democracy anymore by many empirical measures. So I suggest maybe we think carefully about whether we really want to give it that name any longer. But it is still, of course, called a democracy. by all politicians. They cannot do otherwise. But on the right, continuing to call this a democracy requires high levels of propaganda and disinformation. So a key part of the minority rule strategy is to invest heavily in political propaganda, both in the form of think tanks that produce disinformation on all of those topics I just mentioned, but also media outlets such as Breitbart and Daily Caller, and of course, Fox and Rush Limbaugh, who was recently given the Medal of Freedom by Trump. So to close, I'm going to mention just a couple of things about the media, and we'll come back to it, I'm sure, in discussion. But I'd like to suggest that there are two media systems operating in the US right now. One still produces news and daily reporting on government and environment and society and other topics. But the other system serves up a daily dose of hate, conspiracy, attacks on opponents, and as we have known to call them, alternative facts. This system, from Fox to InfoWars to Breitbart, helps its audiences deflect mainstream news reporting and turn it back on those of us in the reason-based community, you might say, as fake news. So just as an aside here, it is beginning to worry me a bit that the age of reason that produced these liberal democracies may be coming to an untimely end. So this alternative reality system attracts roughly the same audience that has steadily supported Trump, no matter what he does, which is about 40 to 45% of Americans. And it turns out that this thin minority, or this large minority, still matters to legitimize minority rule. If Trump steals this election, and I believe he will try, the propaganda system will brand his authoritarian or illiberal regime as the will of the true people. The underlying appeal to the right-wing base is to keep the nation safe from minorities and imagined radical leftists who threaten the greatness of a white Christian society. This, I think, is what Make America Great Again really means. And so the propaganda system and the corruption of political institutions go together hand in hand in this case. So I'm going to close on what's next, look for the upcoming events. First, I think that there's going to be enough confusion surrounding this election and intense support from the MAGA crowd, the Make America Great Again crowd, to send the elections into the courts, where there is now a Republican 6-3 majority at the top of that system. And as I said earlier, watch what happens in Pennsylvania. And if Trump and the Republicans steal this election, which they could well do, the chance at political rallies that are led by Trump to lock them up, lock Biden up, lock Hillary up, lock the governor of Michigan up, lock Anthony Fauci, our disease control expert, up, these may not just be empty threats. So on that cheery note, I will turn it over to Dag for the next speaker introduction.
Dag, please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Lance, for that not so cheery, but very interesting analysis. Now we give the word to Karin Henriksson in Washington, sitting next to you on my screen. Karin, please give us your introductory remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, and it's a great honor to be with all of you. And I'm not as used as the other speakers here to do, you know, long lectures. And anyway, I picked media as my topic because that's something that I'm kind of familiar with. And my starting word is the fakers. That was the latest version of fake news in Donald Trump's performances at his rallies. And I used the word performances intentionally because he's become more and more like a stand-up comedian with the same kind of interaction with his audience. There's cues that everybody understands, and you know, blink, blink. And in this case, it's the President of the United States pointing to the back of the venue and everybody turns around and they all hate the media. And he says, there they are, the fake news. They don't report on whatever he has said, and which is obviously not true. The media report about basically everything he does and says. And then after that little opening, I was going to ask myself a few questions and answer them too. And the first one is, did the media miss the support for Donald Trump in 2016? Were they so isolated in their own elite bubble? And my answer would be no, not necessarily. They really did report from the Rust Belt, and they, I don't think anybody could miss that there were lots of unhappy people, and they were felt that they were, let down by the system, etc. And the problem was rather, as a lot of us have talked about many times, is that the then influencers, I guess you would call them, they really misread the polls. And besides, I think also we should point out that his victory was really very slim, only 77,000 votes in 3 states. And then maybe we could also quote the chief editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, who has said several times as a response to Donald Trump's accusations about his staff and so many others. For a journalist who've been in serious media all my life, it's really offensive, this language. Anyway, so Dean Baquet has said, we are not the opposition party. And then also after the election in 2016, there were a lot of talk about false equivalence, and that the media gave equal space to Hillary's email problems, and then they didn't necessarily spend as much time and effort covering Donald Trump's business failures and other failures. And the question then is that true? I would say yes and no. The email story fit the image of Hillary Clinton as being an elite politician, not wanting to follow the rules. And her denial at the first press conference was really not particularly credible. And as for Trump, there was also a lot of coverage of him and his background. And there were also a lot of warnings from, for instance, the ghostwriter behind his bestseller, The Art of the Deal. But obviously his success from The Apprentice really overshadowed stuff that had happened 20, 30 years ago. And then you could ask the same question today. Are the media digging into Joe Biden's past? Does that get as much attention as what Trump is doing now? And I would say they could do more. But also his weaknesses as a politician and as a candidate, they are really pretty well known. And the other question that a lot of people really talk about is, of course, what about the media's responsibility when it comes to Donald Trump's lies? And then obviously the media report about the lies every day. There are fact checkers everywhere. And it's obviously difficult for the media. So there is this question saying, okay, should they not print or repeat or broadcast the lies? But how could they not? I mean, he is the president of the United States. But the resources and space and airtime they devote to these lies obviously moves the focus away from what Donald Trump really does as a president. And then they also risk solidifying or cementing the lies and help him with his own strategy, which is to repeat the lie so many times that everybody believes them. And since he's so shameless, it's very dangerous. And, that he suddenly, it's not even fake facts, it's made up facts, if you can make a distinction between those two. But he, the last thing, he really just blurts out things that have no grounding. He said, for instance, that the congressman from Minnesota, Ilhan Omar, if Biden is the next president, she will be the Secretary of Homeland Security. And that is really skillful, you have to say. He was pushing on a bunch of buttons at the same time. And then next question is, why don't the journalists ask Donald Trump tougher questions? Why don't they put him against the wall, as the Swedes would say? And then the answer is, well, they are trying, but it's almost impossible to get him to answer a straightforward question. There are only a few who have managed. And the last time somebody tried was 60 Minutes correspondent Leslie Stahl. And she even warned him, I'm going to ask you some really tough questions. But he left the room. So much for being available to the press or the media. And then somebody has asked me why journalists don't cooperate. Why don't they, continue asking the same question if he has given the word to somebody else? And then the answer is obviously that, well, they are competing, and maybe they had an editor who wanted them to ask us about a specific topic. So it really doesn't work quite that way. And I guess my time is getting to the end. So let me just say one more thing, and that is about the money. Trump himself has said many times, you will miss me. You have made so much money from me that you'll be poor. The New York Times will have to fold. And there is probably some truth to that because Donald Trump has been profitable. Audiences have flocked to TV, to the cable channels, and to even the New York Times has a record number of subscribers. So that's true. But then I think everybody, including us around here, I would so don't think that he will disappear, even if he loses. So he will continue to be a source of income, I'm sure. And then finally, I'll just say that my impression is that right-wing sentiment is more profitable than left-wing sentiment. So it'll be there. And if Joe Biden wins, I'm sure that Donald Trump will be the #1 hater, Biden hater. And there'll be a lot of tweets, and he'll be everywhere talking about how horrible Joe Biden is. And there will be an audience for that.
Okay, thank you so much, Karin, for a perspective from the media and from you as an active journalist who are working in the field. And interesting distinction between right wing and left wing, the profitability of the left and right wing news. Okay, we will now turn over to Tacoma, Washington, and we will give the word to William Haltom, Wild Bill, as it says on your screen. Wild Bill, please.
All right, thank you, Doug. I've got a central thesis today. I draw from the 2020 campaigns, not just the presidential campaign, the lesson, seeming beats being until it doesn't. Political rhetoric, imagery, and dramaturgy routinely postpone realization. But reality, which Philip K. Dick, the novelist, defined as that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away, reality lurks until it looms. In 2020, President Trump has tried to talk his way past COVID-19. COVID-19 did not go away. It lurked for a short while, then it loomed, and then it landed on the Trump campaign. The president denied but failed to defeat a pandemic with public relations, imagery, and lies because some actualities kept peeking through the curtains and spoiling front stage appearances. COVID proved President Trump's repeated assurances empty and his optimistic predictions false. COVID negated many advantages of his presidency, even as COVID reaffirmed many shortcomings in his performance and performances. COVID ravaged what President Trump called, quote unquote, the greatest economy in history, unquote, distracting his audience from what the president took to be his greatest selling point in 2020. While we should not forget that Vice President Biden held a steady lead over President Trump for much or most of 2020 and had been the opponent President Trump most wanted to avoid long before the president began to mismanage the pandemic, the reality of deaths, illnesses, shutting down the economy, and shutting in the populace severely impaired Trump's electioneering. If, for the moment, amid a pandemic, reality has overcome pseudocracy, by which I mean the rule of falsehoods in US politics and government, if reality has overcome pseudocracy, what Lance Bennett long ago labeled the politics of illusion remains forever busy and perpetually hungry in the United States. So I offer again my timid thesis. Expect delusion of self and others to work, except when it does not work. Rejoice when demagoguery does not prevail. But even as you rejoice, ready yourself for the next demagogue and the new demagoguery. Hint, new demagogues were running in other races in this year. They're down the ballot, but they're on their way up. Looking past Trump and Biden and tomorrow or next week or next month or next year, whenever we get the election decided, I urge you to see in 2020 this warning. Beware pseudocracy in America. Even if Mr. Trump was a one-of-a-kind entertainer, demagogue, and deceiver, he induced, his power seduced, and his bullying reduced so many Republican office holders to conformity and entranced so many, the polite term is low information, voters to luxuriate in personal delusions and mass-mediated illusions that more polished demagogues and their enablers cannot be far off. I hint again, the new demagogues were running in other races in 2020. They're making their way up. Seeming will again beat being until it doesn't. So in American electioneering, expect appearances to overcome actualities, expect entertaining information to overwhelm expertise, and expect cunning to overmatch character. If actual, verifiable facts from time to time reassert themselves, they soon enough will be obscured by new, improved political marketing and governmental consumerism. In ancient Greece, demagoguery and democracy, please remember, evolved side by side. In ancient Rome, an imagined republic soon enough needed bread and circuses to fend off mobs. The father of the American Constitution, James Madison, devised means by which reason might overcome passion, reliably withstand an American genius for subordinating verification and embracing verisimilitude. We Americans tolerate verification derived from the Latin for making truth, but we embrace verisimilitude, which is derived from the Latin for simulating truth. I hope that American virtues tend to be virtual. Americans do, it is true, do verification in science and engineering and in scholarship. But they, and thus I, overdo verisimilitude, by which I mean illusion and superstition, virtual reality, and infotainment, information conveyed in the formats of entertainment. So, I counsel you today to attend to and to admit the enduring culture and persistent polity of the United States of America. The weaknesses that Donald Trump has exploited were evident to poet Robinson Jeffers in 1935. As Jeffers, those of you who like Jeffers are students of classical Latin, that would be Ave Caesar to the Oxford Dons. Ave Caesar, hail Caesar. He wrote the following: no bitterness, our ancestors did it. They were only ignorant and hopeful. They wanted freedom, but wealth too. Their children will learn to hope for a Caesar, or rather, for we are not aquiline Romans, but soft, mixed colonists, some kindly Sicilian tyrant who will keep poverty and Carthage off until the Romans arrive. We are easy to manage, a gregarious people, full of sentiment, clever at mechanics, and we love our luxuries. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, very much for your comments from the Pacific Ocean and Tacoma, Washington, and some poetry. We now turn to the last speaker, Frida Stranne, who teaches, as I said, at Halmstad University College and is an affiliated scholar at SINAS in Uppsala, but who is joining us from Stockholm, not too far away from where I'm sitting. She's joining us from an apartment in Vasastaden, and I'm sitting on Kungsholmen. Frida, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me and for very interesting opening remarks of my colleagues here. I have an unstable network, but I hope that you will hear me during my remarks here. As I'm a researcher within the field of peace and conflict studies, I would like to use my minutes to focus on the polarization and the worrying potential that it will worsen further and maybe lead to violence, I would say, of who wins tomorrow, the election tomorrow. And not necessarily this week or next month even, but in the foreseeable future. I've studied the polarized climate for over a decade, and I have for many years considered that the risk with the deepening polarization has been overlooked. Already during the Obama years, 2009, 2010, when I was doing field work around the United States, I became seriously concerned about the intensity of the conflicts that existed between different groups and the way it kind of rapidly developed in wrong directions. The feeling of frustration, concern for the future, combined with also growing poverty and inequality and the lack of faith in the ideas throughout its history has been a fabric in the American identity. And all of us know, of course, that the United States has always been polarized, as the road ahead always has been contentious, and perhaps because the fact that polarization is part of US history may have contributed to neglecting the risk about what the polarization actually means at present, and how in some ways it might differ from the past, which of course is something that is debatable. Also, the US has always been an unfair society with a huge gap between rich and poor, but the notion that my children probably will get a better future have made those differences acceptable for many. But as more and more people lost their faith in the possibility to the American dream, which is what many studies have showed, the stability weakens, and that is also a very important factor. So I think some factors with the polarization today differs from what it has looked like in the past, which at the same time make the development perhaps more worrying. And I hope I'm wrong, but I can't see how any politician would succeed in breaking this development without it first leading to more clashes and probably also more violence, because we know the American society is violent, and there are also lots of guns everywhere. I must underline that I'm not talking about the civil war. I know many are stand today. One should be very careful about using that word also, I think. But you don't have to go that far to have reason to fear that it will become very serious and lead to serious consequences. The risks of more and also more serious and more violent clashes in various places is imminent, I think. And of course, in the long run, if not contained, it could be a very serious threat. What I think in some way differs from other turbulent times in recent history, and what I think is important to highlight is the poison combination of one, the polarization that is not just about a single issue or perhaps two issues, but instead a polarization that cut deep scars between people on almost every issue. If the US should be involved in the war or not, but instead disagree on everything. And two, as I also mentioned, the lack of faith in the American dream and other core ideas about what America is, that has always been something that has kept the people together. Three, an increasing injustice, as I also mentioned, and inequality, as well as an uncertainty about the future, the fear of globalization and the growing gap. And then also the media logic that promotes conspiracies and the existing division and makes it almost impossible to have a decent conversation about how to move forward and also meet the challenges ahead. We have the climate crisis, and we have the pandemic now, and many very urgent issues to deal with. The combination of here makes a perfect storm, so to speak, and are factors that constantly also reinforce each other, like a snowball moving downhill. And we must also understand, I think, for many Americans, when you travel around and talk about these things, the threats are existential. At the same time, the disgust and the fear of the other, which is more or less always about the Democrats versus the Republican and vice versa. And it goes for both Republicans and Democrats. With the combination of factors I just mentioned, you have the ingredients that make people look inwards and look at one's own group and strengthening the in-group affiliation. And the foundation is there. In addition, that wasn't enough. We must add a declining trust in the democratic institution, a growing contempt for the elite, and a lack of trust in media, as well as a discussion what is true and what is not true. I mean, people are not even, can't even come together in facts and what is true about certain things. And you also have all the things that Lance Bennett pointed out in his opening remarks about the question of voter suppression and is the US a working democracy. Biden may have has a good ambition to unite and work over the aisle, I think, but to be honest, the task is overwhelming. And the split in his own party will not be painless going forward. If he were to create a cabinet with both Republicans and Democrats, which I think he will, if he wins, it could bend the negative curve, absolutely. But the experiences of vulnerability, the effects of the pandemic, and the anger all over requires so many changes and consists of so many incompatible interests also. I don't think they will find a way to avoid turmoil, riots or whatever, but perhaps their response will be able to ease tensions. And Trump, as it seems like he is perhaps about to lose, but being outside the White House can also be as destructive as him working from the Oval Office. I believe, as Karin said, that his narrative of witch hunt and him being mobilize very strong opposition against the Biden administration within the groups of Trump supporters who are, when you talk to them, extremely afraid of the left moving into the White House. I met several in both Tennessee and Alabama last winter telling me then, even before the primary was over, that if any leftists would move into the White House, they will bear arms. And they are so full of hate and fear for that to happen. And some of what Karin pointed out in her opening remarks here, talking about Trump as Biden hater, I think that is very true. So Trump, he hates to lose and has in some way, I think, to package a loss in a way that not admitting his own shortcomings, but to let someone else. He's staying in the White House. It could even be a more stable outcome, but on the other hand, it would endanger so many other things about the democracy, of course. So we have a frightening situation, I think, and we do have to pay attention on all these factors that are now working together in a combination that lead to tension, and it's definitely big risk for this to become more violent and put more tension on every part of the American society. I end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Frida, very much for your introductory comments. And thank you to all four of you for your insightful comment. Lots of things to think about there and things to talk about there, I think. We will now take a 5.5-minute break and stretch our legs, get a glass of water or something. It is now 14 minutes after 7 o'clock in the evening in Stockholm. And in whatever time zones you are, it's going to be 14 minutes after some o'clock. So let's meet back here in 5 minutes time, shall we? And then we will continue this discussion.